the story here is mainly about people leaving the political system. The counter-revolution against this new elite is very, very strong. So what I'm suggesting here is not a conspiracy. It's simply that as this group have moved left, they're taking the institutions which they dominate with them. I briefed Boris Johnson twice, and it was immediately clear to me that he really did not understand why all these working class voters were voting for him. It's why Trump is doing very well in the US, it's why Le Pen is doing very well in France, it's why Vox are doing very well in Spain, Chega in Portugal, Sweden Democrats, the AfD in Germany.
Matt, here's the £1 million question. Hello and welcome to Tell Me More, the first English-speaking talk of Germany's weekly newspaper, Die ZEIT. My name is Jochen Bittner. I'm the London correspondent of Die ZEIT. And what I want to do in this show is to give space to highly interesting people from the Anglosphere, who I believe should be heard by a wider audience, not only but also in Germany. And my guest today is Matt Goodwin. Matt Goodwin is a professor of politics at the University of Kent and also a senior advisor at the Legatum Institute in London. And Matt, I dare say that you are not only a political scientist, but also a political interventionist. You are a prolific writer and debater. You have one of the biggest Substacks in Britain, and you are the author of several best-selling books, including National Populism, The Revolt Against Liberal Democracy, which was translated into various languages. But your latest book that we want to talk about today, and I have it here, of course, is called Values, Voice and Virtue, The New British Politics. And what I found so interesting about your book is that you lay out a striking explanation as to what is happening in terms of the rise of right-wing populists. And this rise is not only happening here in the UK, of course, but also in Germany, in France, in the Netherlands, across the West, in the US, of course, with the rise of Donald Trump. And your explanation for their success is that we are witnessing a realignment of the political landscape, which means that voters are turning to new party and leaders because they don't feel represented and heard by the traditional parties any longer. And one key sentence in your book reads, "It was ultimately the establishment that created anti-establishment populism." Let us go into the details of this in a minute. But first, Matt, tell me more about yourself. Why are you doing what you are doing, and why are you so passionate about this subject?
Well, firstly, I'd like to thank Die ZEIT and your colleagues for allowing me to share some thoughts and ideas with you. I'd like to thank people who are tuning in and listening to this interview. I'm an academic here in Britain, but I also feel very strongly that this country, like other Western democracies, has reached what I would call a civilizational moment, that we are facing a number of challenges on multiple fronts related to the political class, related to mass migration, political distrust, the rise of populism, all of which I think are symptomatic of what I'm trying to explore in this book, which is the extent to which the people who rule over our society are becoming increasingly disconnected from the people who have to live with the consequences of their decisions. So what I've been trying to do here in Britain and increasingly beyond is get a debate going, a better debate, a more interesting debate within a national conversation that reflects the values and the voice of millions of people out there who don't feel represented in the institutions.
Right. And you're talking a lot about the new elite in your book, which you say has been disconnected from the majority in Britain as well as in other countries. And you say, for instance, that compared to the 1960s and 70s, today's elite is mostly made up of academics who share a different set of values than compared to the broader population. Can you explain this in more detail. In how far are those value sets different than of the elite and the population?
Yeah, I mean, my argument essentially is that we are witnessing the rise of a new ruling class that is very distinct and different from the old ruling class. It is mainly comprised of people who are university graduates from elite institutions, who tend to live in the big cities, who live in the university towns, who tend to have parents who belong to the privileged middle class or the upper class, who tend to be financially affluent, who tend to lean to the cultural left. They're very supportive of issues like immigration, multiculturalism, gender ideology, critical race theory, the idea that Western nations are inherently racist. The new elite are also very socially exclusive. They're the most likely to distance themselves from people who hold different views and beliefs. They're the most likely to unfriend people on Facebook, block people on Twitter who hold values that they disagree with. And my argument in this book is it's not just about the universities, but the new elite have been basically accumulating political, economic, and cultural power within the political, media, creative, and cultural institutions. So what I'm suggesting here is not a conspiracy. It's simply that as this group have moved left on issues like migration and diversity and gender, they're taking the institutions which they dominate with them. Now, in Britain, that relates to the BBC, the House of Commons, the museums, the galleries, the universities. Obviously, in Germany, France, in Italy, we all have our equivalents. But it's this disconnect between the new ruling class and the people who have to live under them that explains why, over the last 20 to 30 years, our politics has become much more volatile and much more combative. And that's certainly my argument in the book.
Right. Since you mentioned the BBC, but there are other news outlets, especially here in the UK. You have GB News, you have Talk TV, you have explicitly conservative newspapers like the Daily Mail, the Daily Telegraph, the Spectator. So one could say that despite of all what you are describing, conservatism is very alive and kicking in the UK, is it not?
Well, there are a few things to disentangle there. Firstly, if you look at our media class overall, and the Reuters Institute at the University of Oxford have done this work, they've surveyed all people in the media class, and they found that overall, nearly 60% of journalists openly associate with the left wing of the political spectrum. More importantly, the rise of new media, like GB News, which is a conservative television channel, Talk TV, they have partly arisen because our legacy institutions have been so insular. And if you look at the media class in Britain today, 90% of journalists in Britain belong to the graduate class. Half of them have gone to Oxbridge, so Oxford or Cambridge. And over the last 20 years, what we've seen is the collapse of local media, regional media. So if you're a working class kid from the east coast of England, your chances of making it into the national conversation are very minimal, or almost non-existent. And it's not just media. I could say the same about the cultural industries, the creative industries, publishing, political institutions. The key point here is that if you hold conservative viewpoints, if you think immigration in Britain should be lowered, if you think demographic change should be slowed down, if you think the institutions don't represent your voice, if you don't believe in gender ideology, that children should choose between 100 different genders, if you don't think Western nations are institutionally racist, your views and your values are nowhere near as represented in the national conversation as the views and values of social liberals and radical progressives. And that is fundamentally the problem that we have in Western democracies. So we need to reform the institutions, we need to shake them up and get more views, more voices into them.
Let's stick with the issue of immigration for a second, since you mentioned this. I guess that's one of the examples where the value sets of the broader public differ from the elite that you described. But I mean, again and again, throughout the last 14 years, the British have voted in conservatives to parliament, to government. They even voted to leave the EU in order to bring down immigration. And still the opposite has occurred. Net immigration figures are at record levels. How do you explain this? I mean, one could say that the elites should have listened by now.
Well, the answer really is two words: Conservative Party. The Conservative Party fundamentally misinterpreted what Brexit was about. If you take all of the evidence in the social sciences, it's very clear. People voted to leave the European Union because they wanted to lower net migration from where it was before the Brexit referendum, about 350,000 people a year, meaning 350,000 people are coming in than leaving every year. And they wanted to slow the rate of demographic change. Now, what's happened since then is that under Boris Johnson, Liz Truss, Rishi Sunak, the Conservatives have allowed net migration to rise to 700,000 a year. Now, how did that happen? Well, they liberalised the system. So we had much less immigration from inside the European Union, and we had much more immigration from outside of Europe, from Nigeria, India, Pakistan. We had more people arriving illegally into the country on small boats. The point being, yes, people voted for the Conservatives. In 2017, 2019, in both of those manifestos, the Conservative Party was explicit. It would lower the overall level of immigration.
So I think it is important that we continue, and we will continue to say that we do want to bring net migration down to sustainable levels. We believe that is the tens of thousands.
So what we're going to do is we're going to have an Australian-style, points-based system that will allow us to control who comes in and make sure that we do not have so many people coming in without skills, without jobs.
What I'm saying to you is very simple. The Conservative Party lied to the country. They lied to voters. And so those voters now are saying they won't vote for the Conservative Party at the next election in 2024, which is why the Conservatives in the national polls are on 22% of the vote, some of their lowest ever levels of support, which is why we now have a populist Reform Party, the successor to Nigel Farage's party, which is doing quite well in the polls, because the Conservatives never understood what Brexit was about. Brexit was never just about creating a self-governing sovereign nation. Brexit was about lowering migration and strengthening our national borders, and the Conservatives failed to deliver on that.
Right. But to say that they lied to the British public is a stark accusation.
No, they lied.
Why should they do this? I mean, they are facing extinction in the next general election.
Because the British Conservative Party are Tories. What I mean by that is they are a pro-business, liberal Conservative party. Boris Johnson was not a Conservative. One of the biggest misportrayals of Boris Johnson was that he was somehow a Donald Trump figure. That was completely inaccurate. Boris Johnson was a bohemian liberal, meaning that he was instinctively socially liberal. He was part of the elite. He was very comfortable with legal migration. He was very comfortable with having weak national borders. And so as a consequence, what the Conservatives have presided over are levels of net migration which would have made Tony Blair, the architect of mass immigration, wince. They would have made Tony Blair feel embarrassed about the level of migration into the country. And look, this is my big concern about British politics, and I think it speaks to France, it speaks to Germany, it speaks to Italy. What we know is that as levels of immigration continue to rise, as demographic change continues to speed up, people are going to become much more supportive of anti-immigration, anti-system populists. That's been the story of the last 20 years. The reason Alternative for Germany are doing very well, I would argue, is because of these issues over migration and Germany's borders. The same story in Italy, in France, in Sweden, in Portugal, and here in Britain. Had the Conservatives delivered what they promised, which is net migration levels of 100,000, 150,000, and also high-skill migration, which is what Boris Johnson said, we're going to get the best of the best, what we actually got was the opposite. We got low-skill migration, low-wage migration. You know, Britain's just had 2 million people come into the country over the last few years. What percentage of those people came on high-skill work visas? 15%. 15%. So we're not getting high-skill workers. We're getting lots of students, the relatives of students, the relatives of workers, asylum seekers, and illegal migrants. So what we have, I would argue, is an immigration system that is completely broken and is why the Conservatives are doing so poorly in the polls.
Right. And I mean, you talked about the Reform Party, which is the successor of the Brexit Party, just to make that clear again. And if the polling about, correct me if I'm wrong, 15% at the moment in the polls, which is not a big threat to the Tories, given the first past the polls voting system that you have here. But still, the Tories seem to be afraid of the next general election, and there are right of centre conservatives within the Tory parties who actually want a change of course, right? So you have this kind of counter-revolution that you describe in your book for the general public. We have that within the Tory party as well, haven't you?
Just to be clear, Brexit was supposed to solve populism. Brexit was supposed to eradicate Nigel Farage, national populism in British politics. That was the point. But because Brexit was so badly delivered, because it was interpreted by the Conservatives as being about more immigration, what it's done is it's led to the return of national populism in the form of the Reform Party. And this is a successor to the UK Independence Party. It's a successor to the Brexit Party. It's polling 15% in the national polls, which is significant because remember, if you look at who's voting for reform, a third of Reform Party's voters used to vote Conservative, okay? So about a third, yeah. So Reform Party's vote is mainly coming from people that would have supported Boris Johnson in 2019. This is a really big problem for Rishi Sunak. So the bigger that the Reform Party get in the national polls in early 2024, they're only 4 points behind the Conservatives in the national polls. What some people are beginning to suggest is, could this insurgent populist party actually replace the Conservatives in the polls? Now, if that starts to happen, if Nigel Farage returns to politics, if other people get involved with the Reform Party, could this actually push Britain into a Canada 1993 situation? And that's a situation where, in a first-past-the-post system, the progressive Conservatives, the liberal Conservatives, were effectively replaced by national Conservatives. And I think that's one of the first occasions in a first-past-the-post system where a big party was replaced.
Wow. And do you think that's probable here in the UK?
Well, I think there are a few things to keep in mind about British politics. The first is that we've never had levels of volatility in Britain like this. And by that, what I mean is people moving from one party to another. You know, Liberal Democrats going to Labour, Conservative voters going to Reform, Conservative voters going to none of the above, saying they're not going to vote. We've had 10 years of populist revolts in British politics. UKIP, Brexit, Boris Johnson. So nothing is impossible, okay? So what we are on the cusp of is something that I think Britain has never really seen before, which is the implosion of the dominant Conservative Party, one of the most successful political parties in the history of democracy. Why is that? Because it presided over mass immigration, it presided over inflation, it presided over the collapse of our public services, National Health Service, schools, infrastructure, but more fundamentally, it became completely disconnected from the realignment that Brexit introduced. Brexit gave the Conservative Party a historic opportunity to win working class voters, non-university educated voters, older voters, and Brexit voters. Those were the four groups that came behind the Conservative Party. But over the last 4 or 5 years, the Conservatives have alienated all of those groups of voters by giving them the opposite of what they promised. They didn't really make the best out of Brexit. They didn't give them lower migration. They didn't get tough on crime. They didn't define what is global Britain, what is our new role in the world, where are we going? And so those groups have abandoned the Conservative Party. So what I'm trying to say is the realignment that Brexit made possible, this big, sweeping, wholesale electoral change, has been completely squandered by the Conservatives, who never really understood who was voting for them. I briefed Boris Johnson twice. I gave Boris Johnson 2 presentations on who was voting for him and why. And it was immediately clear to me that he really did not understand why all these working class voters were voting for him. He just thought he was popular, he was charismatic. And I kept saying, you do understand these people want things. They want lower migration. They want Britain to remain Britain. They want Britain to remain a Western country, Western ways of life, rule of law, with British values. They don't think Britain is racist. They don't think Britain is a backward country. They don't want to apologise for empire. They want to believe in who they are. And Boris Johnson and today's Conservatives have essentially become social liberals in that they've never really been able to understand or speak to national Conservatives out there in the country. And that is fundamentally why they've come unstuck.
Okay. Now, Matt, here's the £1 million question, if you like. If all this is the case, if the British are so unhappy about the disconnect between them and the cosmopolitan elite, why then is it that Labour now is by far the most popular party in the polls? I mean, it's leading ahead of the Tories by 20-odd%.
Yeah, the old saying in British politics is that opposition parties don't win elections, governments lose them. Yeah. So what you've seen is a very important point. The Labour Party under Keir Starmer is on 41-42%. The Conservatives are on 21-22%. So surely this reflects an outburst of mass public enthusiasm for Labour Party policy. Well, not true. What's happened is Conservatives have left the pitch. Conservatives have left the game. So if you look at all of our recent by-elections, what's happening is not the Labour Party vote going up. What's happening is the Conservative Party vote collapsing because many people are now saying, I'm not going to vote at all at the next election. I'm not going to participate in the next election. I'm certainly not going to move over to the Labour Party. So what Keir Starmer, the Labour leader, has done is he's stabilised his party. He's won back some professionals, some university graduates. He's doing very well among British Muslims, by the way. About 80-90% are saying they're going to vote for the Labour Party. He's doing well among minority voters. But the story here is mainly about people leaving the political system. And this is really important because this is what happened before Brexit. Before the Brexit referendum, people just stopped voting.
You also speak of a counter-revolution against the new elite. And you also write in your book that Boris Johnson might have been able to tap into this counter-revolution as a character, as someone who came from a privileged background but still was able to connect with Brexiteers and working class. So do you think he missed a chance there?
Boris Johnson will go down in the history books as somebody that was given a unique opportunity to reshape British politics in the way that Margaret Thatcher and Tony Blair reshaped British politics. But historians will remember him fundamentally as a failure.
Forgive me.
As somebody who didn't really get his arms around his party, around the country, around his new electorate. The counter-revolution against this new elite is very, very strong. It's comprised of working class voters, people that didn't go to university or didn't go to elite universities, and cultural conservatives. Many people in the professional classes too, who are saying, look, immigration's out of control. I'm worried about the rise of Islam in Western democracies. I'm worried about this alliance between radical Islamism and far-left politics. I'm worried about the breakdown of law and order. I'm worried about gender ideology. I don't want my children being taught that a man can become a woman and a woman can become a man. All of these types of arguments and ideas, these are majority positions in Britain. Okay, these are majority positions. So the counter-revolution is very strong. The question is who can tap into it and mobilize it to the extent that it can be mobilised in politics. So far, only Nigel Farage and initially Boris Johnson showed themselves able to do that. But there will be other figures in the future. There will be other politicians who tap into this incredible sense of frustration with our ruling class, a ruling class that doesn't really care about reflecting and articulating the values of the forgotten majority. And that is, I think, where we are in many Western democracies. It's why Trump is doing very well in the US. It's why Le Pen is doing very well in France. It's why Vox are doing very well in Spain, Chega in Portugal, Sweden Democrats, AfD in Germany. It is a sense that the people who dominate the institutions are no longer in touch with the people who are living outside of those institutions in the rest of the country. So the answer is we need to reform the institutions. We need to make sure our public square is more representative and more respectful of the wider majority. That's the answer to this story. Now, of course, liberals will say, I don't want to do that. I want to keep the public square for myself. I want to shut down alternative voices. Well, you can keep doing that and see what happens. I mean, we will most likely end up with Donald Trump returning to the White House. We'll end up with President Le Pen. We'll end up with the AfD, I'm sure, doing very well at state elections at the end of this year across eastern Germany, and probably doing very well in national polls as well, because I don't think fundamentally over the last 10 years social liberals have really understood the strength of feeling against them.
Talking about voice and respect, as you just did, by voice, you mean that, or the ability to get heard in society and public and be respected for one's views. And I'd like to quote a passage from your book on this, where you say that while the new elite dominate the institutions, they also move to exclude the voice of groups that do not share their values and which are now glaringly underrepresented in media, politics, the creative industries, and more. Is the state of the institutions really that bad? Can you give examples of what you mean?
Well, I think certainly in Britain the institutions are that bad. I think if you looked at our universities, just to start with one area where I'm familiar with as a university professor, between the 1960s and today, the ratio of left-wing academics to right-wing academics has increased from 3 to 1, so meaning for every 3 left-wing academics there's 1 conservative, to 10 to 1, so for every 10 left-wing academics there's 1 conservative.
Same with the US.
Say, well, it's worse in the US. In the US, it's in some institutions you have no conservatives. In some areas, anthropology, sociology, it's 30, 40, 50 to 1. If you look at the BBC is dominated by the children of graduates and who often themselves went to the elite institutions and are much more socially liberal, I would argue radically progressive, woke, than the rest of the country. If you look at look at Parliament, the House of Commons, the biggest single group of members of Parliament in the British House of Commons are political careerists, people who have only ever worked in politics. They tend to have gone to elite universities. We know from surveys of MPs they lean much further to the cultural left than the average voter. So on issues like migration, multiculturalism, Israel, all of those issues, they are much further to the cultural left than the average voter. The museums, the galleries are falling over themselves to apologise for British history, to apologise for who we are, to say that we should be ashamed of our national identity. So I do think it is as bad as I say. Look, because we are supposed to be living in a representative democracy where everybody's voice is respected to the same degree. What we saw in the years after Brexit in this country was the opposite, which was the new elite, the ruling class, the losing side, treating the rest of the country as though it is a morally inferior mass of bigots, racists, transphobes, homophobes, and they displayed a level of prejudice that would not be directed to any other group in British society. I could not imagine the elite speaking in that way about Black Britons or British Muslims or LGBT communities. But when it came to the working class, when it came to white pensioners, when it came to Brexit voters, it was acceptable. You could mock, you could insult, you could dismiss. And this reflects the intolerance of the new elite. On the one hand, they say they are liberal, they say they are enlightened, but they are actually among the most illiberal group in our society.
So what you're saying is that we are seeing a backlash of people who feel not only unheard and not only disrespected for their values, but even condemned for their values.
What I'm saying is we're witnessing the rise of what I call in the book a luxury belief class. And what I mean by that is the new elite derive social status, esteem, honor, recognition from displaying their morally righteous, socially liberal views. It's become a new indicator of social status. 50 years ago, 100 years ago, it was about going on the right holiday or having the right top hat, belonging to the right private members club, here in Mayfair. That's what it was about. That's how you displayed your status. Today, you display your status through your luxury beliefs. You advocate policies that bring you no costs, but impose enormous costs on everybody else. Mass immigration, gender ideology, critical race theory. We should have weaker national borders. Why do the elite advocate those policies? They're not going to feel the full effects of them, but what those policies are going to do is make them feel good, allow them to signal their moral righteousness, and crucially, distinguish themselves from the inferior, the morally inferior masses who hold the wrong views, who hold the wrong beliefs. But actually, those beliefs are held by 80% of people in this country. Only about 10% of Britain says, let's keep increasing immigration. Only about 10% of Britain says, let's call pregnant mothers pregnant persons. Only 10% of Britain says, let's allow children to change their gender, right? Or let's give children puberty blockers. These ideas, these elite beliefs, are fringe beliefs out there in the country. But if you look at the institutions, they would have you believe that these are mainstream views. These are acceptable, fashionable, zeitgeist views, when in reality, they are minority views held by a small member of the elite.
Let's look at the nature of what you call counter-revolution to those luxury beliefs. It appears to me that the nature of this counter-revolution in Britain is somewhat more civilized than the counter-revolution taking place in Germany. If you compare the Reform Party to the AfD, for instance, you wouldn't hear so many racist undertones or tones with Reform politicians. Correct me if I'm wrong there. I mean, we in Germany, we are always very quick to refer what is happening today back to the 1930s, to fascism. And that may be right in some instances when it comes to certain politicians. But I wonder how helpful it is to explain really what is happening today. What's your view on this, and where do you see differences in the counter-revolutions in Britain and in Germany?
Well, inevitably there are differences. I mean, if you compare British and German culture, the foundations of our post-war identity are completely different. Our national identity is premised on anti-fascism. We defined ourselves by our finest hour, by standing alone against fascism and Nazism. We have never been made to feel ashamed or embarrassed by our national identity, and it is an identity that has been continuous through history. We can stretch it back 1,000 years without feeling as though we have needed to reinvent who we are. And I think obviously in Germany, the culture is very different. You know, you have very good reasons for why you had to reinvent your identity, and your post-war national identity was based very much on shame and embarrassment and a discontinuity in your politics and in your political culture. So it is entirely understandable to me that for all of those reasons, you are much more sensitive to the accusations of fascism and extremism and so forth. But also our civic culture here in Britain, I think, has held up in a much more robust way over a longer period of time. So Britain has liberalized overall, I think, to a greater extent than France and Germany and Italy. I think we've become much more accepting of migration and multiculturalism to a point. In Eastern Germany, I think it's very different because of the history, because of the Cold War, because of the levels of deprivation, because of all of that. I think, parts of Germany, your experience has been very, very difficult. And there is something about Britain too that speaks to the importance of our mainstream tradition of Euroscepticism. So if you think about somebody like Nigel Farage is not an anti-immigration populist in the way that I would say Marine Le Pen is an anti-immigration populist. Nigel Farage or the Reform Party come instead from a mainstream tradition of Euroscepticism that was held by Margaret Thatcher, that was held by Winston Churchill, that was held by people on the left like Clement Attlee. And so our populism has been slightly softer and has been more mainstream because it's come from within the mainstream tradition of Euroscepticism. I think in Germany, looking at the AfD, you can clearly see that this is a tradition that has come from outside of the mainstream post-war consensus, that has certainly tapped into ideas that have a long history in Germany, but is very explicitly opposed to the mainstream culture.
Right. Well, we in Germany, we might also not have come completely over the idea of an ethnic element of citizenship, which is a very alien concept to the British, of course.
Yeah, we would increasingly define Britishness through a thin civic lens, whereby subscribing to the rule of the game, the rules of law, respecting the institutions, having a British passport, adhering to a loose sense of British values is what many people in this country would consider to be enough to be British.
Support also something that a lot of immigrants are striving for, actually.
Sure, but support for ethnic conceptions of Britishness have been declining consistently over the last 50 years. But within that, there is still a debate about the extent to which newcomers are adhering to British ways of life, to British values, and to British institutions.
But that's not an ethnic argument.
It's not an ethnic argument, but it is an argument that is about substantive belonging, which is not simply about having a piece of paper. It is about sharing a belief in our national ways of life and the national community. And if October 7th and the aftermath of the demonstrations in support of Palestine and Gaza and the rise of Islamist violence have shown us anything, it is that within Britain we have a not insignificant number of people who do not want to participate in our ways of life and who certainly do not share what I would consider to be British values. And that debate around multiculturalism, around a policy that has prioritised group difference over commonality, that debate, I think, in this country is only just getting going. It's not so much an ethnic debate, but it is still fundamentally a debate about national belonging. How do we define Britishness?
Well, in this fight, I guess that socially conservative immigrants and Muslims could be allies, right? I just read a figure that saying that 63% of British Muslims were concerned about the rising levels of Islamism in this country. That's more or less the same figure as non-Muslim British are concerned about the rise of Islamist movement in Britain. So you could still say that the majority of immigrants have very much the same concerns, although of everything we are seeing during those marches here in London and elsewhere every Saturday.
I think there is a debate about to what extent are moderate Muslims in Britain calling out radical Islamism and extremist Islamism within their midst. And I think in the aftermath of the October 7th attacks, what has concerned a lot of people is the silence within British Muslim communities at calling out some of the slogans and anti-democratic positions that we've seen on the streets of Britain. Open sympathy for Hamas, which is an extremist Islamist group, open support for anti-Semitic slogans and chants. And there are no-go areas in Britain where if you are a British Jew, you simply cannot walk through those neighbourhoods. It is simply not safe. And I don't think it is irresponsible to ask British moderate Muslims to stand up and make more noise to disassociate themselves from the radical Islamist threat that we have within our society. This is not an insignificant threat. The security services have said that if you look at all of the referrals that we have in our counter-extremism policy, about 80% of those are because of radical Islamism. So the equivalence between extremist Islamism and the far right, that equivalence is misleading. Most cases, most referrals under the counterterrorism strategy relate to radical violent Islamism. That is the dominant threat that is facing our society and Western societies. So I think we need to try and get to a place where moderate Muslims are just as vocal in calling that out as everybody else. And unfortunately, I don't think we're there yet.
Matt, what about yourself? Do you feel politically homeless yourself?
I would describe myself as being very similar to the average British voter. I'm very skeptical economically about globalization, about the role of big business, about the role of global firms in trying to keep wages as low as possible and relying on immigration to keep their profits high. But I'm also, on cultural issues, I support lowering migration, I support robust integration, the promotion of British values, the belief that there's much to be gained from our history, from a shared sense of identity, from a shared sense of values. And so that puts me where the average voter is. Now, when you look at our two big parties, Labour and the Conservatives, there are lots of reasons why millions of people out there now say, about 60%, now say neither of those parties represents people like me. They feel that both parties are too far to the cultural left. Labour Party, the Conservatives are indistinguishable. Both support mass immigration. Both are increasingly woke or socially liberal in their cultural policy. And then on economics, the Conservatives are too far to the right. They celebrate free trade. They celebrate globalization. They are completely oblivious to the negative effects some of these policies have had in working class communities. And if you look at the Labour Party, to be honest now, there's not much difference between them and the Conservatives. So that is why, for people listening to this interview in Germany, the one thing I would say is, Brexit was supposed to bring politics closer to the people. Brexit was supposed to restore the principle of popular sovereignty in British politics. And in the end, what it has done, it's pushed politics further away from ordinary people. It's delivered policy outcomes that most people didn't want to see, and it's pushed both of our big parties to turn in on themselves and away from millions of people out there who have been voting at elections. So I don't actually think Brexit has resolved much in this country. I think, if anything, the rebellion that began with Nigel Farage, then Brexit, then Boris Johnson, I think that rebellion is just waiting to find its next expression, its next big moment.
So Brexit has only been the start of the counter-revolution?
I think this country is going to go through considerable political turmoil over the next 10, 15 years. I think what we are likely to see at the next election is a return of a Labour government, which will be very unpopular. It has no big strategy for solving illegal migration. It has no big strategy for lowering legal migration. It has no big strategy for integrating communities and tackling Islamist violence. It will enable the radical woke left. It will allow those groups to become even stronger. So I think by the time that Britain gets to the end of the 2020s, my big concern, the reason I'm outspoken on many of these issues, is that we will simply end up going all the way back to where we were before the Brexit referendum, with a politics that is divisive, a politics that is populist, a politics that is combative, a politics that is fundamentally rooted in the belief that the people running Britain no longer really care about or respect the people who are living in Britain.
As a last question, I'm not going to ask you what you're going to, or who you're going to vote for, but I want to ask you what your preferred way out of the situation is that you just described.
Well, I'll tell you who I'm going to vote for. I'm going to vote for the Labour Party because I think that the only way forward for this country is to ensure that the Conservative Party suffer a very serious, heavy and historic defeat that forces Conservatives to really wrestle with the questions they've been ignoring. What is conservatism today? How can it better connect with the country? How can it recruit a new and more sustainable electorate? What does it think about these big issues that it's been avoiding or making worse? Mass immigration, our breaking model of multiculturalism, the rise of Islam within Western societies. It says nothing about these issues apart from keep going, stick with the status quo. I think there are really only two options here. One is you try and realign the Conservatives. You basically try and take over the party from within. You try and build a new vanguard. You try and reshape the party, but that is very difficult. Those are the only two options. But right now, the Tories, Conservatives, need, I think, to experience a very heavy historic defeat to force them into confronting this existential crisis that they're now facing.
So the Tories have to die in order to live again?
Yeah, I think from the ashes of a very, very, very serious defeat, there might emerge something that is more credible and in tune with the country. I mean, this is, the history of the Conservative Party is a history of a party that has reinvented itself. Disraeli, Churchill, Thatcher, Cameron, Boris Johnson. This is a party that has constantly reinvented itself. The Conservatives, if they are to survive, will have to reinvent themselves again. And that means, what do they want to say to working class voters? What do they want to say to non-graduates? What do they want to say to Northern England, not just their friends in the City of London? What do they want to say to pensioners? What's their plan for mass immigration? What's their plan for saving this country? These are all the kinds of questions that they need to really think about, because they've not been thinking about those questions really since before the Brexit referendum. And they've responded, as we can all now see, terribly to this unique opportunity they had to reshape not just the country, but to reshape themselves. And they failed to do that.
That has been fascinating. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for your time.